The keynote speech 2 shall now commence. First, Mr. Tokura Masakazu, Chairman of Kei Danren, will give a speech.
経団連会長の徳良です。第4回 TCFD サミットの開催を心からお祝い申し上げます。さて、豊かな地球環境を次世代に残すべく、我が国は2050年カーボンニュートラルと2030年の温室効果ガス 46% 削減に国を挙げて取り組んでいます。経団連ではこうした気候変動への取り組みを経済成長につなげ、経済社会の根底からの変革を進めるべく、グリーントランスフォーメーション、すなわち GX を提唱しております。これを実現すべく、本年5月には提言グリーントランスフォーメーションに向けてを取りまとめました。本年の TCFD サミットがこれまでのビヨンドゼロウィークを改め、新たに GX グリーントランスフォーメーションウィークの一環として開催されることは、我々の考えと気を一にするものであり、大変心強く感じております。グリーントランスフォーメーションによる社会変容を実現するためには、様々な分野で多くの投資が必要となります。我々の試算では、2050年までに400兆円が必要と考えております。こうした投資を促していくため、日本政府でも今後10年間で官民合わせて150兆円の投資実現を目指すとしております。また10年間20兆円の政府財政支出をコミットしていただいてますが、これはあくまで民間投資を促す火付け役であります。投資の主役は民間部門であり、そのためには資金を動員するための環境整備が重要となります。この点、本サミットのテーマであります TCFD 提言に基づく気候変動関連開示は、サステイナブルファイナンス全般の基盤となるものであります。日本における TCFD 賛同企業の数は本年7月末時点で1000を超え、世界最多となっております。経団連としても TCFD 開示企業のさらなる裾野拡大や金融機関、投資家とのエンゲージメントの促進に取り組んでいく所存であります。2050年に向けてグリーントランスフォーメーションを実現していくためには、現時点ではまだ実現していないゼロエミッション技術を開発し、社会実装していく必要があります。その意味で研究開発、イノベーションへの投資が極めて重要となります。こうした認識のもと、経団連ではチャレンジゼロというプロジェクトを推進し、企業の挑戦を後押ししてきました。現在では200近い企業団体が参加し、研究開発、社会実装、ファイナンスに関する野心的な挑戦が表明されています。こうした取り組みを行う企業をぜひ長期的にご支援いただければと思います。また、イノベーションは一朝一夕には実現しないことから、当面今ある技術、すなわちベストアベイラブルテクノロジーを総動員していくことが重要となります。従いまして、トランジション技術の実装に対しても資金が回るようにしなければなりません。トランジションファイナンス促進のツールとしては、日本政府がトランジションファイナンスに関する基本指針を昨年5月に策定しております。また、企業のトランジション戦略の適格性を判断する参考として、分野別の技術ロードマップも示しています。これらを活用し、日本国内のみならず、トランジションファイナンスを一層普及させることが、世界の脱炭素の実効性向上にもつながると考えます。今回の TCFD サミットでは、こうしたイノベーションやトランジションに取り組む企業が、投資家から適切に評価される情報開示のあり方等が議論されると伺っております。こうした議論が我が国のグリーントランスフォーメーションの実現につながることを心から期待しております。 ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you. Next, Mr. 半沢淳一, Chairman of Japanese Bankers Association, will give a speech.
全国銀行協会の半沢です。本日は TCFD サミットの開催、誠におめでとうございます。また、このようなスピーチの機会をいただき、主催者である経済産業省様に御礼申し上げます。本日は銀行界の代表として三菱 UFJ フィナンシャルグループの取り組みも交えながらお話をさせていただきます。2015年に金融安定理事会が気候変動に関連した開示のグローバルな枠組みを作るために TCFD を設立してから7年となります。2022年の今、銀行を含めた企業にとって開示の充実は経営上の最重要テーマの一つと言っても過言ではありません。2050年ネットゼロという世界共通の目標に向かって全世界が脱炭素社会への移行に向けて歩みを進めていく必要がある中、開示は全ての起点になると考えています。2019年に始まった TCFD サミットでは全銀協会長にスピーチの機会をいただいてきました。これまでの会長のスピーチではネットゼロ社会への移行という大きなタスクを成し遂げるためには銀行がお客様と積極的なエンゲージメントを重ねていくことが重要であるとお伝えしてきました。またその足がかりとして銀行とお客様双方の開示を行動化していくことが重要であるとも申し上げてまいりました。この認識は今も変わらず、むしろ開示の重要性はより高まっており、銀行を含む企業に対して開示の一層の高度化が求められていると認識しています。この1年を振り返ると、2021年11月のCOP26 においてグラスゴークライメットパクトが採択され、脱炭素社会への移行に向けた取り組みを世界で一丸となって加速させることが再確認されました。開示についても大きな進捗がありました。ISSB が正式に設立され、グローバルなサステナビリティ開示基準案が示されており、日本でも ISSB 基準に沿った国内基準の制定に向け SSBJ が発足し、議論が始まっています。銀行界も脱炭素社会への移行に向けた取り組みを強化してきました。一例として三菱 UFJ フィナンシャルグループでは TCFD 定義に沿った開示の充実化、高度化を進めておりますが、今年4月には昨年公表したカーボンニュートラル宣言から1年が経過したことを踏まえ、将来の目標とそこに至るための基本的な考え方を可能な限り丁寧に開示しました。特に投融資ポートフォリオの GHG 排出量の中間目標設定とその開示は、中長期的な銀行の脱炭素経営の在り方や実際の移行過程における機会やリスクを考える上でも重要な取り組みだったと感じています。さて、開示促進の取り組みを進める中で、銀行にとって特にこの1年で重要性を再認識したことがあります。それは銀行自身の開示と同様に、お客様の開示も重要であるということです。お客様の脱炭素化は一足飛びに実現できるものではなく、脱炭素への移行、すなわちトランジションの考え方に基づき取り組むことが重要です。銀行はエンゲージメントを通じてお客様の状況や課題、移行計画を理解した上で、トランジションにあたってのニーズにきめ細かく応える必要があります。お客様のニーズはファイナンスに限らず多岐にわたるため、 それらを適切に把握し、お答えするにはお客様から透明性の高い開示をいただきながら、エンゲージメントを深め、解決策を具体的に探っていくことが重要となります。実際にお客様とのエンゲージメントを通じて、カーボンニュートラル実現の難しさを理解するとともに、脱炭素社会に向けたトランジションやイノベーションを促進するためのファイナンスの重要性も実感しているところです。すでに存在する脱炭素技術の社会実装や未来の技術革新に向け、リスクを見極めつつ、ファイナンス等を通じてカーボンニュートラル実現に貢献することが金融機関が果たすべき役割であると改めて認識しております。これらの取り組みを金融機関に閉じたものとするのではなく、正確な開示により社会のさまざまなステークホルダーの皆様からご理解と信頼をいただくことが極めて重要と考えています。日本は2050ネットゼロに向けた中間目標として、2030年には2013年対比で 46% の温室効果ガスを削減するという目標を掲げています。その2030年まで10年を切り、我々は今まで進めてきた取り組みをより一層加速させなければなりません。銀行もお客様と一緒に進めてきたエンゲージメントと開示をより一層積極的に推進し、実体経済の脱炭素化に貢献してまいる所存です。世界で最も多くの企業が TCFD の枠組みを採用している国が日本です。その日本の産業をお支えする銀行として、開示の枠組みづくりに向けたグローバルな議論にも貢献していきたいと考えております。実体経済の脱炭素化と銀行のネットゼロは表裏一体であるとの考えに基づき、お客様と手を取り合い、より良い脱炭素社会への移行に向けて取り組んでまいりたいと思います。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Hatakeyama Yojiro, Director General Industrial Science and Technology Policy and Environment Bureau at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. Mr. Hatakeyama, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Director General of the Industrial Science and Technology Policy and Environment Bureau at the METI. So I'm going to talk about how we can make a steady progress to carbon neutrality and the importance of the role played by the finance to achieve that goal. Take a look at the slide. Of course, toward 2050, we are going to achieve the carbon neutrality. And it is not easy to achieve that goal. It is an ambitious goal. And towards that, of course, and we cannot, and it would be ideal if we can adopt all the decarbonization technologies in all sectors and at once. But not all companies can do it. One reason is that there are no such technologies existing depending on the sector, and it takes a lot of money, especially for how to abate sectors. It will take a lot of money to do that. And the third is that the decarbonization technologies in energy, renewable energies, including solar and wind and so forth, and depending on the regions, the resources are unevenly distributed. So from these reasons, it's not easy to achieve the decarbonization goal. just once. So the transition will become very important. And the investment in the transition, whether it is an energy savings or fuel conversion and so forth, which will be required, a lot of investments will be needed in that front too. So that means we need finance too. So, and this transition, which is supported by finance, that will be the way forward to steadily progress in the reduction of GHGs to achieve the final goal of carbon neutrality. So that means that we have to pursue both growth as well as the decarbonization. And then we need to take on the challenges of pursuing the both goals. And as for the government's activities to promote transition finance, there are three. One is the setting up of the basic guidelines. That is the financing of the transition, and also establishment of the procurement in accordance with the international ICMAR standard. We'd like to create the basic guidelines for the domestic companies. Second is setting up the sector roadmaps. And we are now working on this. And so far, for 7 sectors, we have created a roadmap. And that is the 7 sectors, steel, paper, and pulp, and so forth. And we will add automotive in this list. And the third is the model projects. What kind of finance is in alignment with the overall international trend? And then, so we will select the, we have selected 17 model projects, and we are going to support these projects from the financing perspective to compensate for the cost. And so the major points for the roadmap, there are 3 elements: comprehensiveness, ambitiousness, and feasibility, which are required to ensure credibility in terms of comprehensiveness. And there are 3 sectors, and which account for a little less than 70% of the emissions. And if we add on automotive, that will be 80%. And as for the ambitiousness, committing to net zero, that is pre-condition. And also it has to be in alignment with the Paris Agreement. And also it has to be updated by technological progress. And third is feasibility, in line with the government policies, and thereby ensuring credibility. When you speak of a transition, sometimes there is a criticism that it is greenwashing, but we don't think so. The commitment towards the carbon neutrality and strategy to achieve that must be there as a precondition. So in a way, it is a targeted transition. And this slide shows the transition roadmap for decarbonization of the power sector. And it shows the specific timelines of technologies through which how we can expect the reduction of the GHGs emissions. And also this one is the roadmap for iron and steel, technological elements, and CO2 emission reductions trajectory. And if you compare this and that page, you see the difference in shape. In case of iron and steel, at 2040, you will see the significant decline. So the key for decarbonization is the hydrogen reduction. And such technologies will be made available at that point, from which the reductions will be significant. So by sector, the efforts needed will be different, and also the pathway for carbon neutrality will be different by sector. It will also be different by jurisdiction. And in that sense, the pathway towards the decarbonization should be diverse. And that also should be taken into account in evaluation. Next, the importance of innovations. Globally, half of the reduction at the time of 2050 will come from technologies under development right now, or these technologies are not yet developed. And we have to overcome these technological barriers, otherwise we'll not be able to reach carbon neutrality. So the technological development, and which will also require a lot of financing, and how we make sure the financing in that area is very important for us. And this shows the important sectors in terms of development of innovations, especially because the climate action will have to be developed in tandem with the growth. It's not a cost, but an opportunity. So these 14 sectors needed to take on these activities. In other words, if activities cannot be progressed in tandem with carbon neutrality, with growth, the carbon neutrality cannot be achieved. From R&D to commercialization, although the demand for financing will grow, but it will come in short supply. That is called the valley of death. So, first of all, in the R&D stage, government, because we have established the 2 trillion yen Green Innovation Fund, that is the $14 billion, and the government has decided to support in the long term. And also, in the implementation stage, it's very important to combine public and private finances. So this combination is important. Also, for new business entities to be created, or for the businesses to expand, we need the support tailored for that. And this is about the Green Innovation Fund of 2 trillion yen, and this is the summary of it. Point is that the social implementation and commercialization are very important points. On point 4, maximizing the results of R&D activities so that they can be reflected in the implementation. And to do that, we ask the managers of the companies to work on the long-term activities for social implementation and commercialization, and we will ask for their commitment. And we have been allocating money, and the 1.8 trillion yen has already been allocated out of 2 trillion yen. Lastly, the innovations in decarbonization areas, for them to be implemented actually in society, we need policy innovations. And the challenges for financial institutions, as you can see, there are 3 points. The access to technological information is needed for the financial institutions, and the encouraging the formation of new business entities is also needed, and also the risk sharing between the public and the private sectors in terms of financing is needed. And so we are going to further study how we can share technology and financial information, how we can encourage the formation of new business entities, and thirdly, to talk about the how we can share the risks. There are various studies conducted overseas. So through these, we are going to encourage transition so that we can make a steady progress toward carbon neutrality. At TCFD Summit last year, this transition finance and its importance was recognized. And that was the common understanding of the participants. And we now have entered the stage where we take actions, and the government is now working on that. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention. ありがとうございました。畠。
Now we would like to move on to panel discussion 2. Panel discussion 2, evaluating business efforts on green transformation. The facilitator of this session is Professor Ito Kunio, Chair of the TCFD Consortium and Director of Hitotsubashi CFO Education and Research. Now, I would like to pass the facilitation to Professor Ito. Professor Ito, please.
Okay, thank you. Let's start panel discussion 2. First of all, let me introduce the panelists. The panelist next to me is Reiko Hayashi, Director and Deputy President, BOA Securities Japan, Board Member, ICMM, ICMA. Next to her, Tomohiro Ishikawa, Managing Director, Head of Government and Regulatory Affairs Office, MUFG. Sandrine Eckert, from online, Global Head of Impact Finance Solution, Societe Generale. Hisato Kozawa, Director, Executive Vice President, and CFO, MHI, Mitsubishi Juko. Shinichi Kihara, Deputy Director General for Technology and Environment, METI. The main theme is evaluating business efforts in green transformation, that is GX. The amount of investment required to achieve carbon neutrality is, of course, enormous. And cooperation between public and private sectors is necessary. Under such circumstances, presence of private finance, such as G-funds, is increasing. Needless to say, in order to promote transition in high-emission industries, transition finance is so important. Since the publication of the basic guideline for transition finance, Kihon Shishin, which was published in 2020, METI has development technology roadmaps for each sector in high-emission industries, as well as selection of so-called model projects. As Hatakeyama-san referred to that, it is furthermore important to make a variety of efforts to enhance innovations. I'd like to ask each panelist about how the current state of transition finance in Japan, the formulation of sector-specific roadmaps, and creation of model products are viewed from your own perspective. And what do you think are the challenges for the autonomous expansion of transition finance? Then Hayashi-san, as a first penguin, Could you talk about that?
Thank you, Ito-sensei. As a first penguin, thank you very much for having me today. As Ito-sensei mentioned, my name is Reiko Hayashi, Director and Deputy President of BofA Securities, which is a security firm and then also investment bank arm of Bank of America here in Japan. And then also I'm a board member of ICMA, International Capital Market Association, which set the bond principles for ESG, as you may know. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to those who have contributed or played a critical role to establish TCFD guidelines, and then also the basic guidelines of climate transition finance, as well as roadmaps for promoting transition finance in Japan. Those frameworks have made a great contribution to promote transition finance. We are seeing more issuers using and then also showing interest in transition finance. And then also we are seeing more understanding and then interest in transition finance by investors. Also, it is very interesting to see that recently Asian Transition Finance Study Group published Asian Transition Finance guidelines following Japanese ones. So things are moving forward very quickly thanks to the contribution by the people who have been working for transition finance in Japan. But challenges, we have many challenges. And then as Ito-sensei said, private finance alliances such as G funds are becoming more active, and there are more and more discussion on net zero commitment by the private sector. Consequently, ironically, there has been more concern on financed emission because the short-term financed emission will increase if we invest, or financial investment, financial institutions invest into high emitters in transition finance. Therefore, we need to develop schemes which make investors evaluate corporates more properly and promote investment in transition finance. And then those companies are contributing to reduce GHG emissions, even if they are high emitters. And I'm sure that Mr. Ishikawa, who has been working for Net Zero Banking Alliance, which Bank of America belongs to as well, talk about what they are doing to promote or to make these schemes to promote transition finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Harrison. MUFG chairs the Financing and Engagement Working Group in the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Societe Generale is also NZBA member. So could you talk about the discussion on transition and NZBA from MUFG, Ishikawa-san? And after that, I'd like Societe Generale to introduce a specific example of efforts supporting energy transition. And also, could you talk about financial institutions' perspective on the evaluation of and engagement in corporate efforts and strategies toward achieving carbon neutrality? Ishikawa-san, go ahead, please.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for having me. My name is Tomo Ishikawa. My wife and my two daughters always tell me that I talk too much. So if I go beyond the allocated time, just say stop, just shut up, and I'll stop there. But as Professor Ito, you indicated, MUFG joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance last year. I think it was June last year. I sit on the steering group of Net Zero Banking Alliance. This is almost like a board of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. I also chair one of the working group called Finance and Engagement, which I will come back to just because we published a report, or the Transition Finance Guide, which actually was 10 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, I told the secretariat that I'll be on this panel and make sure that the guide is published when I'm on this panel. So if you Google it, I'm sure it's there. But we just published this transition finance guide, which I've been chairing, and I'll touch on this later in my intervention. But before talking about this transition finance guide, let me start from what may be obvious to you. But what is net zero for banks, and why are we doing this? Why did we commit to net zero? When we refer to net zero, we're talking about net zero of scope 1, 2, and 3. And I'm sure all of you know, because we're in this TCFD discussion, I'm sure you all know what scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. But because banks, we do not manufacture products, vast majority of emission from banks like us are scope 3, what is also referred to as financed emissions, and which is the approach that was developed to quantify the emissions that finance institution like MUFG emits. And as the term of net zero indicates, the goal is to reduce the emissions, scope 3 emissions, down to zero or net zero. The question here then is, what does it take to achieve this goal, achieving net zero of scope 1, 2, and 3? Banks, we often use the terminology, your emission is my emission. Because if I lend you the money and if you emit emission, that is our emission, our scope 3 emission. So you may think that's just because it's outside of our control, you may think that's a risk. Depends on how you look at it. It's a risk, but I would call this as a opportunity because we have skin in the game, right? And what I would rephrase it as your decarbonization is my decarbonization. So that's how we think about when we talk about net zero for our scope 3 emissions. Now, let me discuss why we committed to net zero. The business case for net zero is multifaceted, but one thing I hope to stress here is that we are not doing this for the PR campaign purposes. Rather, this is a journey that involves a transformational change of the way we do business, as we've been hearing from the panelists that spoke before us. When we joined Net Zero Banking Alliance in June last year, the narrative we often heard back then was that divestment is a powerful tool to green our balance sheet, and B, that divestment will increase the cost of capital of brown industries and hence transition will accelerate. Maybe that's true, that's one narrative. But the question we asked ourselves was, is this a responsible banking model in facilitating the transition? And would this deliver orderly transition? That's the question we asked. And the answer was no. That doesn't make sense, at least in Japan or based on our business model. For several reasons. First, divestment will not reduce the absolute emission. Of course, that's not going to reduce the emission automatically. Second, you cannot control who will buy the assets once we sell it. So what's going to happen as a consequence, who knows? And that's not something we want to see as a consequence of us divesting loans or investment. Third, we will no longer be able to actively engage with our clients. So that's the consequence of divestment, and therefore we do not think divestment is an option. Then what is the answer? How do we reduce our scope 3 emission? The answer is pretty clear, that we need to be proactively engaging with our client to facilitate our client transition to net zero. And based on this conviction, I propose to set up a working group within Net Zero Banking Alliance. It's called the Finance and Engagement Work Track to produce this transition finance guide. Based on the intensive discussion among the working group members, we agreed that transition finance is an essential pillar to accelerate our journey to net zero. But transition may mean different pathway or a different strategy. In Europe, they'll probably tell you that the coal thermal has to be decommissioned and the investment to renewable will bring about transition. Maybe that's true in Europe. But here in Japan, our view, for example, is that coal firing with ammonia, hydrogen, that's how you bring about the transition. So European approach to transition versus Japan or Asia would be different. And I think difference is okay. There's no reason why one size has to fit all or that the one approach should be applied in all regions. So when we developed this Net Zero Banking Alliance Transition Finance Guide, which is here, again, it's published already. What we stress here is that it is high-emitting sectors that require funding and resources from banks like us. And I often use the analogy of doctor and patient. The way I phrase it is you need the best doctor to take care of the most serious patient. Not that I'm talking about the high-emitting sector being the serious patient, but you want the best doctor to take care or deal with the most challenging bit, as opposed to just talking about the green financing and making investment in green finance, but forget about the high-emitting sectors. So you want best doctor, and we think we're the best doctor in town. So we want to spend more time with the high-emitting sector and facilitate their transition, as opposed to just focusing on green activities and forget about the brown or less green sectors. So that's the approach we think makes sense to bring transition here in Japan or in Asia. And that's exactly the message we hope to send within this Net Zero Banking Alliance Transition Finance Guide. So it's out there. If you could have a look at it, that would be great. But of course, if you have any comments, if you have any suggestion, how can we scale up or mainstream transition finance, your suggestion, your comments would be very much appreciated. Happy to come back to this, but let me stop here because I assume I talk too much. Thank you.
I was afraid to, like his family, Ishikawa-san would speak too much to stop. This is the case. Okay, next, Sandrine-san, could you talk about that? Go ahead, please.
Hello, good afternoon. So I'm Sandrine Anguard, heading the Global Impact Finance Solutions team of the Global Banking and Advisory Department within Société Générale. With my team, we are working at introducing within all our activities ESG features, meaning sustainable finance, of course, but also accompanying the transformation of our services to support the transition and acceleration of our clients. Because as my colleagues mentioned already, that clearly there is an acceleration of the transition, clearly needed, but also we could see and observed within our partner clients, corporate FIs, and NetZBA is clearly an illustration of this. Of the commitment and the responsibility that banks are taking regarding their Scope 3, which is their indirect one. Of course, the Scope 1 and 2 for banks are not the most impact that we have within our activities. So clearly, it means for us to have a look at our, of course, carbon footprint trajectory at the bank, at the global, including the Scope 3, but also for our clients to have a look and what are they committing in reducing their scope, their emissions. Of course, and this is the complexity of the subject, it's just that for each company, this trajectory is unique because they have different trajectory to achieve linked to what are their current activities and what are their current, I would say, historical implementation facilities. And it may be different than what is expected at sector level, meaning that we could define sector trajectory, like the EIA will build on to achieve the net zero, but we have to deal with clients who may not be achieving this at the same path trajectories. And for many sectors, second point, for many sectors that we have to, and we are working with and our clients, the transition to a low carbon economy encompasses new business models, which means that we need to better understand what are the development of these new value chains. If we took the example of the electromobility value chain, for example, the success of the transformation relied on development of EV manufacturing capacities, but also EV changing infrastructure, gigafactories to produce the batteries, but also green steel to make car more efficient, and also the sourcing of the batteries, components, and things like that. Once we have looked at all the key challenges we are facing within this new electromobility value chain and new capacities to be built on each path, each steps, it's clearly no longer a subject of only one actor in a unique activity. And so as a bank, as we are within the, I would say, the collective, the collective clients and able to make the connection between themselves, we have also a responsibility, and it will be a key part of the achievement of the Net Zero Banking Alliance commitment to reduce our carbon footprint. And so for this and to achieve this, we are developing new competencies And clearly, we have a strong ongoing training program for our coverage teams, which is developed by our experts. The idea is clearly to deploy all its environmental and social competencies within our teams, because it's a very complex, as I explained, subject. And we want to make sure that our fronting clients are clearly up to date on the mega trends that the different sectors are facing, and just to make sure that they are able to have this knowledgeable discussion with our clients to better accompany them. And so clearly, to come back to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the achievement of our commitments will rely on a well-balanced management and of our activities between the green asset financing. You were mentioning the renewable, which are at the European level would appear like the unique solution, but it's not only, and we fully agree with you, it's even in Europe, it's not the only solutions. And also to support our clients, which are engaging within an ambitious transition journey, which may not be only going through only green activities clearly, but also in reducing their carbon footprint within their current activities.
Thank you, Anthony-san. Needless to say, disclosure is imperative for manufacturing and energy industries, which must make a transition. We'd like to hear from company side on the experiences on transition finance and the challenges and the importance of disclosure. As you know, MHI Mitsubishi Juko has been very famous for aggressively making effort to do green transformation. So, Kozawa-san, could you talk about that?
Hello, my name is Hisato Kozawa, CFO of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries since April 2020. I'm honored to have the opportunity to participate in today's panel discussion. Thank you. Our company, MHI, announced its medium-term business plan 2 years ago in October 2020. At that time, we framed the energy transition as an important way to realize carbon neutrality and committed to increase our efforts in this area. In October last year, we announced Mission Net Zero, in which our commitment to reduce our CO2 emissions, that is our Scope 1 and 2, and as well as our Scope 3 emissions after reduction by CO2 capture, to zero by 2040. We also began disclosures in accordance with the TCFD framework and guidelines. As part of a series of initiatives toward net zero, MHI issued green bonds in 2020 and 2021, as well as a transition bond in September of this year. Regarding transition bonds, initially, we were unsure if we should issue it because we thought it might be considered greenwashing by some investors. But after more than a year of consideration, and thanks in part to the endorsement of METI's transition finance program, we were able to launch our first transition bond. While green initiatives are, of course, important, but I believe that transition is an essential concept to realize complete rather than partial carbon neutral society. From the perspective of solution providers like MHI, we hope that transition finance will take hold as an ESG finance framework to help develop new solutions, and we are grateful to METIS for promoting it. We also issued straight bonds at the same time as the ESG bond with different maturities. Green bonds were more favorable both in terms of market demand and issuance conditions. And we saw the same trend with our transition bond. The number of transition bond issues is increasing, So I feel that they are becoming an important type of ESG bond. Back when there was a binary distinction between green or non-green in the financial markets, I was afraid that there would be forced divestment from companies or businesses considered non-green. But now, I think that how widely the transition has become accepted lately is proof that the financial markets are shifting their focus from divestment to engagement. In terms of ESG disclosure, as you are fully aware, the ISSB is moving forward with the unification of ESG disclosure standards in order to avoid multiple standards and harmful effects of gaps among standards. My view is that while a unified standard would be a good thing, it would be undesirable for its content to be specified in too much detail. There is a tendency among some investors to focus on comparability, and as such, they tend to request disclosures in a standardized format using the same formulas. Certification that the data has been properly calculated is also likely to be required. On the other hand, industrial companies are involved in a variety of business and accordingly have different methods of contributing to CO2 reductions. I think this diversity needs to be appreciated. From the perspective of engagement rather than divestment, and as a CFO of an industrial company, I feel it would be better to keep mandatory disclosure requirements to a minimum and allow greater freedom of voluntary disclosure, at least during this period when carbon neutrality efforts are accelerating and evolving in a wide variety of areas. We know that society and investors are already focusing their interest and efforts on carbon neutrality, so I believe that companies can be trusted to expand their original disclosures of their own free will without being forced to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Kozawa-san. Since the publication of the basic guideline, I was involved in making the guideline as a chair for the committee. METI has developed technology roadmaps for each sector in high emission industries, as well as selection of so-called model projects. Please talk about the governmental support on promoting transition based upon the voices from investors, financiers, and companies. Kihara-san, please go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Ito-sensei. Good evening to all of you. I'm Shinichi Kihara, Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and I'm very happy to participate in this great session today. As DG Hatakeyama presented, METI has taken the lead in establishing transition finance. And you heard many times about our three-step policy package, about the basic guideline, and then the 7 hard-to-abate sector roadmap. And we have facilitated 12 model cases up to the $2.5 billion US. But our journey continues. Building on all the achievements, METI will continue our strong support on developing transition finance. And I would like to introduce 6 new actions on our table. First, you have already heard that we will add new roadmap on automobile. And this will raise the coverage of the CO2 emission in Japan from 70% by the 7 roadmaps to 80% by adding this automobile. Secondly, we will quantify the roadmap. We plan to run an econometric model that quantifies in figure the future emission in each year along the respective roadmap. We hope that this model will further enhance the credibility and usability of the transition roadmap and support the investment decision by financial communities which are facing the issues of financed emission. Thirdly, we will enhance further engagement by financial institutions. When the companies try harder to invest in decarbonization, the financed emission for the financiers will unavoidably and temporarily increase along the path towards carbon neutrality. And this issue was raised by many here already, including Hayashi-san in her intervention. Thus, it is becoming more important than before to enhance the engagement or communication between financial institutions and companies, especially in high-emission industries. So we plan to formulate a framework to effectively enhance such engagement activities. Fourthly, we will support transition of consortium. Among hard-to-abate industries, there may be a company which does not have sufficient financial resources and is unable to advance its transition efforts solely by itself. We will work on policy measures to provide funds to encourage transition by a consortium of multiple companies. And fifth, we will support SMEs. Towards achieving carbon neutrality, the efforts of small and medium-sized enterprises are also important, as there is increasing pressure from the buyers for supply chain decarbonization. So we will facilitate support for SMEs. And sixth and lastly, we will build international momentum. Japan's efforts on transition finance is not closed inside Japan. We support the wider spread of the concept in emerging countries, especially in Asian region, where energy demand is expanding to grow along with their economic growth. Spearheaded by METI, energy ministers in Asia supported the launch of Asia Transition Finance Study Group, led by over 40 private financial institutions and others last year. And I understand Ishikawa-san's company is deeply engaged in this activity. And last week, in the Asian Green Growth Partnership ministerial meeting, participated by energy ministers from ASEAN, Middle East, and others, the Asian Transition Finance Study Group has released the Asia Transition Finance Guideline and Asian Transition Finance Activity Reports. So Japan will continue our support for establishing transition finance in the emerging countries, backed by our excellence in this field. So transition finance is dynamic and credible framework, backed by comprehensive, ambitious, and feasible sectoral roadmaps. And Japan will continue providing support to the industry, making serious efforts in their targeted transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kihara-san. I feel Ishikawa-san might feel a bit frustrated with the time limitation given to him at the panel. So I'd like to give him opportunity to speak more. I wonder how the NZBA think about the so-called financed emission. Could you talk about that?
Sure. I think banks are, we, including ourselves, but I'm sure it's the same for Bank of America and all banks operating across jurisdictions, we need to manage different stakeholders' expectation. Of course, also importantly, there's regulators, supervisors, that they will look at us and make sure that we manage the risk. And sometimes, or often, they would just look at our scope 3 emission, 1, 2, and 3 emission and say, how exposed are you to transition risk? So sometimes, you know, I'm sure if I were a supervisor, I think I would look at these figures and say, okay, if your scope 3 emission is here, whereas others are here, they will ask you, why is your emission so high? So if you're a supervisor, I think they will look at from a risk management perspective, how exposed are you and what are you going to do to reduce the risk? But at the same time, supervisor is just one stakeholder from our perspective. Investors, whether it's equity, bondholders, they're also part of stakeholders, but they're NGO, civil society, et cetera, they all have different perspective, different priorities. So we need to manage everyone's expectation as opposed to just one or two. I think that's a challenge, but as we heard from Hayashi-san as well as some former speakers as well, the more we support transition, our Scope 3 emission will go up. So we want to make sure that supervisors, authorities, or NGOs or investors do not penalize just because our Scope 3 goes up in short term. I hope, and this is exactly what we also discussed in Transition Finance Guide, we hope to create a bit more flexibility. Maybe that's also consistent with what you heard from the corporate side. There's got to be a bit more flexibility in the disclosure framework so that we are able to discuss or qualitatively discuss why our emissions going up, as opposed to just say, here's a number and it going up. I'm sure people will say, why is your number going up when you committed to net zero? So that's the challenge I'm sure we will face, but it's not just us. I'm sure it's the same for B of A or all other institutions that are committed to net zero. And that's a big challenge. And I hope to have a more policy dialogue with all the policy makers involved so that the level playing field is secured and that we feel comfortable to support transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ishikawa-san, for your fluent explanation for that. So let's go on to the second round of the panel discussion. Hayashi-san, in addition to making transition, provision of funds is necessary for social implementation of green innovative technologies that require the mid to long term to develop. Hayashi-san, could you talk about the challenges regarding fund provision and expectations on corporate disclosure for long-term investment like innovation?
Thank you, Ito-sensei. And then before answering that question, if I may add some comments to Ishikawa-san's. Yeah, I'm talking almost every day to our US counterpart about financed emission, our contribution to reduce GHG emission, and that will be featured going forward after having this publication today. So I'm very looking forward to see more development there. Okay, and then as for innovation, obviously it's not an easy or simple task for financial institutions again to take risks and then also invest in technologies or corporates which are at the early stage of innovation. Therefore, the government needs to make support those companies and then help them commercialize their innovation and then encourage private sector to invest in that, as was mentioned by Mr. Hatakeyama of METI today. And then also, as for corporates, we have already discussed, but corporates need to enhance their disclosure going forward for financial institutions to have better prediction or better predict of risks and returns going forward by investment into those technology. And then also, we need to further discussion on the contents of disclosure, which should be transparent, comparable, and so on. But also, as Mr. Kozawa mentioned, that disclosure shouldn't be too much unified. So it's really hard for us to digest. But for financial institutions, we also need more understanding and then resources on financial institution side to analyze those disclosure by the companies. Currently, we are having the expert panel expert panel on sustainable finance set by FSA to increase human resources in the ESG space. And we are also, and then also in my view, we are still focused on risks rather than opportunities, which are also mentioned in TCFD, but we are still focused on risks rather than opportunities, as I mentioned. So we should continue discussion how to utilize the disclosure and to promote investment in innovative technology and then also innovative companies. And then I like to mention about the excursion which METI arranged before this TCFD Summit on this Monday. I went there. I went to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Takasago Machinery Works, where there are many professionals who are working on to make innovative technologies, including hydrogen. And then, of course, it's still not commercialized yet, but I felt that they are well advanced, and then we are close to be commercialized. Hopefully, I like to hear Kozawa-san's comments, but I felt that this is not for MHI, but there are many, many Japanese corporates which are working so hard to bring innovative technology to promote net zero. And then our financial institutions need to understand further and then have deeper knowledge of their efforts and then reflect our knowledge or understanding to our investment going forward. That's my comment. Over to you, Ito-san.
Thank you. Again, Ishikawa-san, from the financial institution perspective you belong to, could you tell us about challenges in fund provision in implementing innovative technologies and expectation for corporate disclosure? Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much. And Professor Ito, you've been very generous with me, providing third time to talk. So I'll try to be quick. But let me discuss what disclosure mean to us. What does disclosure, TCFD disclosure, mean to banks like ourselves? There's no doubt that sustainability related disclosure based on TCFD framework will deliver significant amount of data, useful data, decision useful data, as we've been hearing. And I have no intention to undermine the ongoing effort of disclosure, whether it's TCFD or ISSB framework. But as you can imagine, banks like MUFG, and I'm sure it's the same for B of A or any other banks, we talk to our corporate clients every day. We're not equity investors. We're not just thinking about what's making decisions based on publicly available data. But we talk to our corporate clients every day. We talk to CEOs, CFOs, but we also talk to finance people, et cetera, to understand their strategies, their funding plans, their also net zero strategy, but also opportunities. So we talk to them every day. So we're not just relying on what's in the public domain, but we just go out and receive tons of information. And that's the source of our opportunity. So that is different from equity investors like asset managers, because they do not want to be insider. They will just solely focus on public information. So that's a difference of banks between banks and also asset managers, whether you're talking about equity or bond holders. There's an increasing expectation that once corporate disclosure or the corporate start disclosing transition plans, that will accelerate transition plan. I hope the answer is yes, but as we've been hearing, the key question here is not about transition plan, but credibility of transition plan. How do you assess credibility, and how do you make sure that you're convinced that the transition plans are credible and you finance or you facilitate transition plan? That's the key question. And I hope that the TCFD or ISSB framework will provide sufficient data, sufficient information to allow investors or banks like ourselves to conduct a full assessment of transition plan, and that we will be convinced that transition plans are credible. One caveat I would add that when we talk about disclosure, we always talk about disclosure project being standardization project so that you can compare company A versus company B. That's good. I'm sure people will appreciate comparability, but comparability may end up creating winners, but also losers. The key question is that the type of consequence we want to see? If you're equity investors, you always want to bet on winners and forget about losers. fine, that's your business. But for banks like ourselves, I'm sure it's the same for Japanese government or any other government. You don't want to create losers and let them or leave them behind. We want to make sure that our journey to net zero is leave no one behind. So we need entire ecosystem, entire Japan Inc. or, I'm talking about Japan, but same for Asia, same for all regions. We need to make sure all of us are moving to net zero as opposed to just winners. So I hope that the disclosure, I'm sure it will be helpful, it would be useful information for investors, but for banks like ourselves, we do not want to just support transition of winners and forget about losers. So that's one key aspect of disclosure. I want to briefly discuss two more things, and then I'll shut up. One is a transition finance guide, as I briefly discussed. So Net Zero Banking Alliance published this. Within this Net Zero Banking Alliance, we showcase METI's roadmap, as we've been hearing. METI's roadmap is there, EU taxonomy is there, ASEAN taxonomy is also included in this transition finance guide, because there's no one correct answer or wrong answer. We wanted to showcase that Japan has its roadmap, but ASEAN has their taxonomy, EU has their approach. So we hope to say that it's not that the one size fits all, but rather we need the regional approaches to net zero. So that's one aspect of net zero transition finance guide that we published. Second one, this is more of a MEFG initiative, but we have been engaging intensively with our leading clients. And based on the engagement, we learned a lot from our client engagement. And the key lessons learned was interdependency between sectors. So electricity, steel, et cetera, you can't just look at one firm or one sector and assess whether their transition plans are credible, because there's so many interdependencies among the sectors. So we conducted the assessment of transition plans, and we hope to publish the result of our assessment, because again, this is not about winning winners and losers. We hope to share what we learned from engagement exercise, and we hope to share with the world. How do we assess transition plan, and what does credible transition plan means? And we call this transition white paper. I hope to make this public in the next few weeks, if not, maybe it's 1 month or so. But again, this hopefully will be key lessons learned, and I'm sure people will appreciate the result of our engagement. Thank you very much for Professor Ito for being generous, and I'll shut up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sandrine-san, thank you for waiting. This is your turn. Could you introduce us specific examples in Europe of financing new technologies and trends in governmental support in promoting financing for mid to long-term innovation? Could you
Yes,
please?
I will try to just summarize in a few words the framework which have been set up and which is currently setting up in Europe to support the transition. First, on the Europe side, we are set up, I would say, on 3 pillars. With just a very short summary. 3 pillars. The first pillar would be to define, and it has already been disclosed and communicated, is what we call the EU taxonomy, defining for activities which are hard to abate, but also activities which are considered as enabler of the transition to low carbon economy, which have been defined some technical screening criteria, meaning that this is for even renewable energy, cement trees, what are the key technical screening criteria that they should achieve to be considered as compliant with the net zero targets we have in Europe. Okay, so we have a set of these technical screening criteria for what is the target for some specific sectors, which is a bit different from what you have developed. And I think it's really interesting regarding the transition roadmap for some hard-to-abate sector, which is clearly highlighting what are the transition paths. When within the Europe side, we are set what is the target, and then let's define what would be the roadmap. And it's part of the discussion we are having now regarding what are the transition paths. So a bit different in terms of approach. And then we have also clearly the subject of disclosure, transparency for corporates, but also for financial institutions. There is key guidelines which are implementing now to make sure that we are disclosing all this information for corporate regarding their greenhouse gas emission targets, current emissions, and on the FI side, same communication, but also some communication regarding our exposure to what is green and what is aligned with the taxonomy, meaning what is the part of the support we are, and the financing support we are providing to the green activities as listed within the taxonomy. So clear key element on disclosure also for FIs and corporate. And third party, which is clearly then once we've put this framework, what does that mean in terms of accelerating the investment toward the green activities and toward the low carbon economy? We have, of course, some funding support programs, such as the Invest EU program, but also the Future Social Climate Fund, which have been adopted by the EU Commission very recently, but also a penalizing approach, meaning for the brown activities, meaning that there is a current consultancy on what we call the brown penalizing factor, meaning that they will put some penalization system regarding the financing of the brown activities, meaning that it will reduce the rentability of the financing of these activities. So it's still under consultancy, but it means that to support this, the acceleration and the need for investment within the green activities to support the transition, we have to deal with these two approaches, supporting, but also penalizing the brown activities financing. Okay, so then also SAVE, which means that it's a bit different approach of what you are setting up in Japan. We are clearly facing first a big need for investment, in Europe, but worldwide needs. And I think Asia is a big part also of the transition investment need. And clearly it won't, at the bank, it won't be only a debt solution. We have to look at all these investment needs, such as a combined approach, debt and equity, clearly, even when we are looking at a standalone project, I would say. So it's clearly a key element of the approach we will have, and also on the collective approach we will have at the bank, but also with all clients, corporates. And we just take one example, because I know that the time is just counted, but clearly what we've done with the hydrogen fund, recently launched last year. So what we call the Clean Hydrogen Fund, which is aiming at developing the infrastructure to make sure that the hydrogen segment is developing well. Air Liquide, Total Energy, and Vinci are combining their forces with other large companies, and they invite other large companies to sponsor the creation of this Clean Hydrogen Infrastructure Fund. So it's now the world's largest fund exclusively dedicated to clean hydrogen infrastructure, which has been done last year and which has already done and invest in 3 projects in Europe and in US regarding infrastructure subject to develop the capabilities of these new solutions, which would serve some mobility solutions, but also industrial solutions. So clearly, innovation is coming from, I would say, the sector, the corporate, but also on the financing side, we are providing new solutions, developing new solutions to make sure that we will be able to support all these tremendous amounts of investment needed to support the transition.
Thank you, Sandrine-san.
Thank you.
As Hayashi-san said earlier, she was so impressed with the high level of green technology of MHI at Takasango in Himeji Prefecture. So from the MHI's standpoint, we'd like to hear the challenges and expectation regarding financing for innovative efforts. Kozawa-san, please.
Thank you, Ito-sensei and Hayashi-san. We are struggling to develop new solutions and maybe proceeding day by day. Then, as I mentioned previously, MHI has received great support from METI in the area of transition bond. Additionally, the Green Innovation Fund has been established in Japan to support and promote innovation. Developing and commercializing new carbon neutrality solutions requires a large amount of funds and long periods of time, so we feel this support scheme is very meaningful. MHA would like to take advantage of the program to develop better carbon neutrality solutions. On the other hand, in the social implementation and commercialization phases following development, is it now necessary to go a step further, such as risk hedging of commercial projects, as well as financial support for corporate entities? Allow me to share some information about a state-of-the-art project in the US, in which MHI is participating as an equity investor from the developing phase. It is called, please look at this slide. Yeah. It is called the Advanced Clean Energy Storage Project, or ACES. The project site is in Utah, and the project involves using surplus electricity from renewable energy generated in the western US to first, produce hydrogen. Second, store it in underground salt domes. And third, supply the hydrogen to a gas turbine combined cycle plant when electricity is needed. The project is funded by private equity and a $500 million project finance loan with a U.S. Department of Energy's guarantee for the entire loan amount. In the case of ACES, the DOE will provide a credit guarantee during the full 30 years of the project, which is very helpful. This is a mechanism whereby public support enables more efficient use of private funds. Regarding Japan, in addition to the Green Innovation Fund, I hope stronger support from Japanese government too. Given the support, not only in the form of credit guarantee, but also direct subsidies for CapEx and or OpEx, Japan will be able to introduce new infrastructure and processes towards decarbonization more steadily and quickly, I think. While this may be a different discussion altogether, isn't there a need for an international framework to support carbon neutrality efforts in developing countries? Global carbon neutrality will not happen unless decarbonization progresses in these countries and regions as well. As developed countries have emitted a large amount of GHG in the course of their past economic development, I believe there should be mechanisms in which developed countries help emerging or developing countries achieve carbon neutrality. And hopefully, Japan will take the lead in creating such a framework, as Kiara-san previously mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Kiara-san, could you talk about government support for the promotion of innovation finance, innovative finance to achieve carbon neutrality? Kiara-san, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Before talking about innovation, I just want to pick up briefly on Kozawa's point on the carbon neutral or developing country. I briefly introduced the Asian Transition Finance Study Group initiative previously, but that's only one piece of our comprehensive approach. We take very comprehensive approach. First of all, we respect the range of pathways by each countries. We respect their roadmaps, and we provide comprehensive policy measures. So we start from jointly building transition roadmap, running a model, and thinking about what is the best energy mix of the country, given the national resource, etc. Then we provide full package of financial support, technology cooperation, also capacity building, all that. So that is our approach, and that is our mission as Japan, to help support the developing country to reach global carbon neutral. Coming back to innovation, yes, it is of course very important, and we have been working a lot on this to facilitate innovation. And it requires a lot of money. We calculate in next 10 years to reach carbon neutral in the next 10 years, 150 trillion yen, or 1.1 trillion US dollar, is needed. So we established a Green Innovation Fund, just like Kozawa-san said. And I was very thrilled to actually see the project in Takasago facility. And the key technology, one of the key technology is the hydrogen turbine gas thermal power generation technology. It generally replaced the natural gas thermal power plant. So this will be a game changer, not only for Japan, but also for emerging countries. On the innovation finance, the biggest bottleneck is the Death Valley that you have seen in DG Hatakeyama's presentation. The Death Valley exists between the demonstration phase and the implementation/commercialization phase. Large amount of money with certain level of risk needs to be financed, including by private funding sources. So in order to tackle this Death Valley issue, METI took lead in coordinating series of intensive discussion called Climate Innovation Dialogue between public-private financial institutions on how to finance implementation and commercialization stage of innovative technology which are not commercially proven. And we conducted case study using a sample project on hydrogen and ammonia technologies under the Green Innovation Fund. And through the intensive discussion, we now find three important directions as way forward. The first is to create a mechanism that can effectively share the information on technology and market between companies and financial institutions. I think this point was raised by Hayashi-san in her intervention. Financial institutions are not familiar with technical aspects of innovation, and also they need substantive market information for them to examine whether the technology can fly or not. Second is encouraging the formation of new business entities. In most cases, innovations will not be implemented by the technology developer, like new hydrogen gas turbine manufacturers themselves, but by others like utilities, which buys and uses that technology. Therefore, the support needs to cover not only the technology developers, but also business implementers and operators. Third, government needs to promote public financial support for large-scale and long-term funds to adequately share the burden, both in terms of nature and volume of risks. EU and United States already have governmental financial support mechanisms, including through debt and guarantees and non-monetary measures such as hands-on advice. And furthermore, through the dialogue, we identify non-financial policy needs related to innovation. Financial communities stress the need for government to cover the demand risk of green products, both in terms of volume and price. In response, METI has started a study group on possible Japan version of Contract for Difference, the CFD, to fill the price gap between hydrogen-based power and ordinary power. The important lesson learned is that in-depth communication with finance communities help us identify needs for effective policy and support measures to make bankable deal. So we hope these policy developments will eventually lead to enhanced predictability for financial communities and help us overcome the Death Valley. Just before closing, one point on the focusing on the opportunity side rather than the risk side. This is very important. We are working on the mitigation contribution concept. In many cases, for example, Japanese heat pump manufacturer, the more they manufacture heat pumps, as a company, their CO2 emission will rise, and that's a risk. However, they are contributing to huge CO2 emission reduction, let's say in Europe. They are replacing all the gas heating system to heat pump. And that big contribution is not an established measurement tool or system to measure these kind of contribution. So that is a very important point, and we would like to further work and develop this agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm afraid our time is almost up. So let me wrap up today's discussion. It seems that we got at least 3 implications from today's discussion. First, in order to expand the autonomous provision of private funds in transition finance, it's important to improve the credibility of companies' transition path. Second, in order to bridge the information gap between financial institutions and companies, disclosure and persistent dialogue are needed. On the side of financial institutions, it is desirable to evaluate companies' initiatives and strategies from the mid to long-term perspective. And on the corporate side, it is necessary to meet the information disclosure needs that can make it possible to engage between both sides. Third, finally, for those that require long-term investment in innovation technologies that have not yet been fully established commercially, it is important for the government to provide support and involvement in the fund provisioning side, as well as to enhance disclosing corporate information on new technologies and their development trends. Thank you all the panelists and participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Ito and the panelists. Thank you very much.